somehow the mountains have always had a very strong hold on me, and from the first time that I visited Aspen, which was when I was courting Annie.
America knew him as the golden boy of folk music, the man who sang about sunshine on his shoulders, Rocky Mountain highs, and a love so pure it could fill an entire country. John Denver was the face of wholesome American values, the guy your parents trusted, the voice that made the whole world feel like a campfire sing-along. But behind that round, wire-rimmed smile and those gentle acoustic melodies, John Denver was hiding something so dark, so carefully constructed, that it took 28 years for the full truth to finally surface. And when it did, it shattered everything we thought we knew about America's favorite country boy. If you grew up in America during the 1970s, there is a very good chance that John Denver's voice is stitched into the fabric of your childhood. His songs played at family barbecues, drifted through car radios on summer road trips, and echoed through school auditoriums during talent shows where nervous kids clutched acoustic guitars and tried to hit those impossibly warm notes. He wasn't just a musician. He was a feeling. He was the sound of golden hour sunlight pouring through a kitchen window. He was the voice of a country that desperately wanted to believe it was still innocent. But the man the world knew as John Denver was not born with that name. And the boy he actually was bore almost no resemblance to the golden-haired troubadour who would one day sell over 33 million albums and become the official poet laureate of Colorado. His real name was Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., born on the last day of 1943 in Roswell, New Mexico. His father, Henry Sr., was a career Air Force officer, a man cut from the rigid, unyielding cloth of mid-century military discipline. And that discipline defined every corner of young Henry's childhood. The Deutschendorf household was not a warm place. His father was frequently absent, deployed to bases across the country and overseas, and when he was home, the emotional distance between father and son was so vast it might as well have been an ocean. Henry Sr. believed in toughness, in stoicism, in the idea that a boy should earn love through achievement rather than receive it freely. And young Henry, sensitive, artistic, desperate for a connection he could never quite reach, learned very early that the version of himself his father wanted was not the version that actually existed. The family moved constantly: Tucson, Montgomery, Maxwell Air Force Base, and with every relocation Henry started over. New schools, new kids, new attempts to fit into a world that always demanded something he couldn't deliver. He was awkward, he was shy, he stuttered, and in the brutal social hierarchy of American adolescence, those traits made him a target. Music became his refuge. His grandmother gave him a guitar at 11, and for the first time, Henry found something that didn't require him to be someone else. The guitar didn't judge him. The melodies didn't demand toughness. The songs let him feel everything his father's household had trained him to suppress. By college at Texas Tech, Henry made a decision that would alter his entire life. He dropped out, moved to Los Angeles, and changed his name. Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., the awkward military brat, the stuttering outcast, was gone. In his place stood John Denver, named after the capital of the state whose mountains he had fallen in love with during a childhood family trip. Within a decade, John Denver became one of the biggest recording artists on the planet. Take Me Home, Country Roads, Rocky Mountain High, Sunshine on My Shoulders, Annie's Song, hit after hit after hit, each one reinforcing the same irresistible image: a gentle, nature-loving folk singer radiating pure, uncomplicated goodness. Wire-rimmed glasses, flannel shirts, environmental activism, that wide, guileless smile. America fell completely, unreservedly in love. But here is the thing about personas built on buried pain. They require constant maintenance. And the more the world fell in love with the character John Denver had created, the more terrified he became of what would happen if that character ever slipped. Because beneath the platinum records and the sold-out arenas and the image of America's most wholesome superstar, the real Henry Deutschendorf was still there. Still hurting, still searching, still hiding behind a smile that was starting to feel less like a gift and more like a cage. And the coping mechanisms he had quietly developed to survive that cage were about to spiral into something far darker than anyone in his glittering, sun-drenched world was prepared to confront. To understand the double life, you have to understand the wound that created it. And that wound didn't start in Hollywood. It didn't start in a recording studio. It started in a series of cold, sterile military housing units scattered across the American Southwest, where a little boy learned that love was conditional and affection was something you had to earn but could never quite hold on to. Henry Deutschendorf Sr. was not an abusive man in the way we typically use that word. He didn't leave bruises. He didn't break bones. What he did was far more insidious and far harder to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. He simply withheld. He withheld praise. He withheld warmth. He withheld the one thing a sensitive, artistic child needed more than oxygen, the feeling that he was enough exactly as he was. Biographers and people who knew the family have described Henry Sr. as a man who communicated primarily through criticism. If young Henry brought home a good grade, his father would ask why it wasn't better. If he showed interest in music, his father would dismiss it as a waste of time. If he cried, his father would tell him to stop. The message was absorbed into the boy's bones before he was old enough to understand what was happening to him. You are not acceptable. The real you is not welcome here. And that is the psychological foundation upon which John Denver built an entire career. When he reinvented himself in Los Angeles, he wasn't just chasing fame. He was chasing the approval his father had never given him, and he was doing it by becoming someone his father could never reject, because the person he presented to the world wasn't really him at all. The sunny disposition, the relentless optimism, the gentle demeanor. These were not lies in the traditional sense. They were aspirational. They were the version of himself Henry Deutschendorf wished he could actually be. And for a while, the performance worked so well that even Denver himself started to believe it. But the human psyche doesn't let you bury pain that deep without extracting a price. By the early 1970s, as his career exploded into the stratosphere, the people closest to Denver began noticing small, unsettling contradictions. Friends described sudden mood shifts that seemed to come from nowhere. Moments where the warm, laughing folk singer would go completely silent, his eyes glazing over with a sadness so heavy it made the room uncomfortable. Bandmates recalled late-night conversations where Denver would circle back, again and again, to his father, to the feeling that no matter how many records he sold or how many stadiums he filled, he would never be the son Henry Sr. actually wanted. More troubling were the private habits that were beginning to take shape behind the curtain of his wholesome image. Denver had started drinking. Not casually, not socially, but with a quiet, deliberate intensity that suggested he was using alcohol to quiet something loud and relentless inside his own mind. First, it was easy to dismiss. The music industry ran on booze. Everyone drank. But those who paid attention noticed that Denver's drinking had a specific pattern. He didn't drink at parties. He drank alone. He drank after phone calls with his father. He drank in the hollow hours between the roar of the crowd and the silence of an empty hotel room. And then there was the perfectionism, the obsessive, almost punishing need to control every detail of his public image. Denver became notoriously difficult to work with when he felt his carefully constructed persona was being threatened. He would rewrite interview answers. He would demand retakes of photo shoots if his expression didn't look joyful enough. He was terrified, genuinely, viscerally terrified, that the world would catch a glimpse of the broken boy hiding behind the golden troubadour. The double life was no longer a strategy. It was a survival mechanism. And survival mechanisms, by their very nature, tend to escalate. Because the more successful John Denver became, the more the gap between the public icon and the private man widened. And the wider that gap grew, the more desperately he needed something, anything, to bridge the unbearable distance between who the world thought he was and who he actually felt himself to be. What he reached for next would destroy his first marriage, shatter the fairy tale that inspired one of the most beloved love songs in American history, and set off a chain reaction of personal devastation that would take decades to fully unravel. If you have ever heard Annie's song, you already know the mythology. John Denver wrote it in 10 minutes on a ski lift in Aspen, Colorado, overwhelmed by the beauty of the mountains and the depth of his love for his wife, Annie Martel. The lyrics are almost unbearably tender. You fill up my senses like a night in the forest, like the mountains in springtime, like a walk in the rain. It became one of the most iconic love songs of the 20th century. A track so pure and so emotionally naked that it made millions of listeners believe John Denver was the most devoted husband on the planet. and for a brief, shimmering window in the early 1970s, he genuinely tried to be. John and Annie met in 1966 in Minnesota. She was a fashion student, he was a struggling folk singer still years away from his breakthrough. Their courtship was the kind of story publicists dream about. Two young people falling in love before the fame, before the money, before the world started watching. They married in 1967, and for a while, Annie was the anchor that kept the newly minted John Denver tethered to something real. She saw the boy beneath the persona. She knew about the stutter, the insecurity, the desperate longing for a father's approval. And she loved him anyway. But fame is a corrosive force, and it ate at their marriage with a speed that shocked everyone around them. As Denver's career detonated in the early 70s, he was gone more than he was home, touring relentlessly, recording constantly, appearing on television specials that beamed his smiling face into tens of millions of living rooms. And when he was home, the man Annie married was increasingly difficult to find. The gentle, attentive partner she had fallen in love with was being slowly replaced by someone restless, emotionally distant, and consumed by a need for validation that no amount of love from a single person could ever satisfy. Behind the closed doors of their Aspen home, the arguments grew more frequent and more vicious. Friends who were close to the couple during this period have described a relationship that looked like a fairy tale from the outside but felt like a pressure cooker from the inside. Denver's perfectionism, the same trait that made him obsess over photo shoots and interview answers, turned inward on his marriage. He wanted Annie to fit the narrative. He wanted their life together to match the story the songs told. And when reality inevitably fell short of the mythology, he didn't know how to process the disappointment, so he withdrew. The couple adopted 2 children, Zachary and Anna Kate, and for a time, the family unit seemed to stabilize the chaos. But the cracks were already structural. By 1979, the marriage was over. The divorce was finalized in 1982, and it devastated Denver in ways the public never fully witnessed. The man who had written the definitive American love song had lost the woman who inspired it. And the irony was so crushing that even his closest friends didn't know how to talk to him about it. Denver's second marriage, to Australian actress Cassandra Delaney in 1988, followed an eerily similar trajectory. The early years were passionate and photogenic. A younger, glamorous wife, a new chapter, a fresh start. They had a daughter together, Jessie Bell, and Denver publicly declared that he had finally found lasting happiness. But the same patterns resurfaced with alarming speed. The emotional unavailability, the long absences, the private volatility that stood in such stark contrast to his public gentleness. By 1991, they were separated. By 1993, the divorce was final, and the custody battle that followed was bitter enough to make local headlines. A third serious relationship in the mid-1990s collapsed under the same weight. The pattern was undeniable by then, even to Denver himself. Every time he tried to build the intimate, loving connection he had craved since childhood, the same invisible wall rose up between him and the person he was trying to reach. He wanted love more than anything in the world. He sang about it more beautifully than almost anyone alive. And yet he could not sustain it when it was standing right in front of him. But as painful as the wreckage of his romantic life was, it was only one manifestation of a much deeper crisis. Because the same void that destroyed his marriages was driving another compulsion. One that was far more dangerous, far more public, and far harder to hide than a failing relationship. And unlike a broken marriage, this particular secret was about to start showing up in police reports in 1993. The city of Aspen, Colorado, the same idyllic mountain town where John Denver had written Annie's song, the same place that had become synonymous with his entire public identity, issued him a citation that sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. John Denver, America's golden boy, the man who sang about clean rivers and clear skies and the sacred beauty of the natural world, was charged with driving under the influence of alcohol. The mugshot was almost unrecognizable. The round, cheerful face that had graced the covers of Rolling Stone and People magazine looked hollowed out, exhausted, haunted by something the cameras had never been allowed to capture. And for the millions of fans who had built their emotional lives around his music, the image was genuinely disorienting. This wasn't supposed to be John Denver. John Denver didn't drink. John Denver didn't get arrested. John Denver was the guy who testified before Congress about environmental protection and founded the WinStar Foundation to save the planet. He was the cultural opposite of a man stumbling out of a bar at 2 in the morning. But that was exactly what had happened. And it wasn't the first time. The truth, which only fully emerged years after his death, was that John Denver's relationship with alcohol had been escalating in private for over 2 decades. The solo drinking sessions that began in the early 70s, the quiet bottles consumed in hotel rooms after phone calls with his father, had gradually transformed into something far more destructive. By the 1980s, friends and bandmates were describing full-blown binges that could last for days, periods where Denver would essentially disappear into a haze of alcohol and isolation, only to reemerge clean, sober, and smiling for the next television appearance as if nothing had happened. The duality was staggering. On stage, he was radiant. He would stand under the lights in his denim shirt and wire-rimmed glasses, strumming his guitar and radiating a warmth so genuine that audiences wept. And then he would walk off stage, retreat to his dressing room, and reach for a bottle with a desperation that terrified the people who witnessed it. The transition was so seamless, so practiced, that most of his crew didn't even realize the extent of the problem until it was far too late to intervene. The 1993 DUI was followed by another in 1994, this time in a residential neighborhood where his vehicle was spotted swerving erratically. The public reaction was a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. Tabloids that had previously treated Denver with kid gloves suddenly turned vicious. Late-night comedians, who had mostly left him alone because he seemed untouchable, began working him into their monologues. The wholesome image that had taken 20 years to build was cracking in real time, and Denver seemed powerless to stop it. What made the situation even more tragic was that Denver knew he had a problem. He entered treatment programs. He made public statements about getting sober. He spoke openly about the pressures of fame and the loneliness that came with it. But the cycle kept repeating: sobriety, relapse, public apology, private shame, and back to the bottle. The addiction was tangled up with everything else. The unresolved trauma from his childhood, the collapse of his marriages, the crushing weight of maintaining a persona that had become a prison. Alcohol wasn't just a habit. It was the only tool he had ever learned to use to silence the voice in his head that still sounded like his father telling him he wasn't enough. And the drinking wasn't even the most alarming manifestation of his self-destructive spiral. Because as the alcohol loosened his grip on the careful, controlled image he had spent a lifetime constructing, another obsession began to surface. One that was even more reckless, even more dangerous, and even more baffling to the people who loved him. John Denver had always loved flying. It was one of the few things that made him feel truly free, truly alive, truly untethered from the weight of his own mythology. But in the final years of his life, that love had mutated into something that looked less like a passion and more like a death wish. And the people closest to him were starting to realize that the sky might kill him long before the bottle ever could. John Denver earned his pilot's license in 1974, and for the first several years, flying was exactly what you would expect it to be for a man who built his entire career singing about the majesty of the natural world. He would climb into a small aircraft, rise above the Colorado Rockies, and experience the kind of transcendent, almost spiritual freedom that most people only ever feel in dreams. From 10,000 feet, the mountains looked the way his songs made them sound: vast, pristine, untouched by the chaos of human life. Up there, he wasn't John Denver, the global superstar. He wasn't Henry Duchendorf, the disappointing son. He was just a man suspended between the earth and the sky, weightless and anonymous and finally, mercifully, quiet. But somewhere in the late 1980s, the relationship with flying began to change. It started subtly. Denver began pushing the boundaries of his piloting skills, seeking out more challenging aircraft, more dangerous conditions, more extreme maneuvers. He purchased a series of increasingly complex planes, including experimental models that even seasoned pilots approached with caution. He started flying in weather conditions that made air traffic controllers nervous. He began taking risks that his flight instructors had explicitly warned him against, risks that served no practical purpose and offered no reward beyond the momentary rush of surviving them. By the early 1990s, the Federal Aviation Administration had taken notice. Denver's pilot license was flagged for review after a series of incidents that painted a deeply unsettling picture. There were unauthorized low-altitude flights over populated areas. There were reports of erratic behavior during pre-flight checks. There was at least one terrifying near-miss with another aircraft that investigators later described as entirely avoidable and entirely the result of Denver's own recklessness. In 1996, the FAA formally suspended his pilot's license, citing his failure to maintain the medical certifications required to fly safely, certifications that were directly connected to his ongoing struggles with alcohol. The suspension should have been a wake-up call. For most pilots, losing your license is a devastating professional and personal blow. You ground yourself. You reassess. You do whatever it takes to earn your wings back. But John Denver did not ground himself. He continued flying. He flew without a valid license. He flew experimental aircraft that required special endorsements he no longer possessed. He flew with a frequency and a disregard for safety protocols that left his friends genuinely frightened for his life. And those friends tried to stop him. Multiple people in his inner circle, bandmates, managers, fellow pilots, close personal friends, have gone on record describing increasingly desperate attempts to talk Denver out of the cockpit. They begged him. They confronted him. They staged interventions that were every bit as intense as the ones they had attempted for his drinking. But Denver would listen patiently, nod his head, offer that familiar gentle smile, and then walk out to the hangar the very next morning as if the conversation had never happened. What baffled everyone was the apparent lack of fear. Experienced pilots are, by nature, cautious people. They respect the sky because they understand how quickly it can kill you. But Denver seemed to have lost that respect entirely. He flew with a casualness that bordered on indifference, as though the consequences no longer mattered to him, as though the outcome of any given flight was something he had already made peace with in a way that none of his friends could comprehend. One close associate later described it as the most chilling thing he had ever witnessed. Watching a man who was supposed to be one of the most beloved figures in American culture climb into a plane he had no legal right to fly, in whether he had no business navigating, with a look on his face that suggested he wasn't flying towards something but flying away from something so enormous that the risk of dying seemed, to him, like a reasonable trade. The people around him knew the clock was ticking. They knew the statistics. They knew that every unauthorized flight was a roll of the dice with odds that grew worse each time the wheels left the runway. But what none of them could figure out, what haunted them long after the inevitable finally happened, was why Denver seemed almost eager to keep rolling. Because the flying, like the drinking, like the broken marriages, like the relentless perfectionism, was not really about the activity itself. It was a symptom, a scream, a desperate, flailing attempt to outrun a truth that had been chasing him since he was a stuttering little boy in a cold military house in Roswell, New Mexico. And in the final years of his life, that truth was about to catch up with him in a way that would strip away every last layer of the double life he had so carefully maintained. By the mid-1990s, the world that had once worshipped John Denver had moved on. The music industry had shifted violently toward grunge, hip-hop, and a new, ultra-slick brand of commercial country music that had little patience for the gentle acoustic sincerity of a 1970s folk icon. The arenas that used to sell out within minutes were replaced by state fairs, smaller regional theaters, and overseas tours where audiences still clung to the nostalgia of who he used to be. For a man whose entire sense of self-worth had become inextricably linked to the roaring approval of stadium crowds, the silence of shrinking venues was deafening. Denver felt like a ghost in his own industry. His record labels dropped him. Radio stations stopped playing his new tracks, relegating his massive catalog strictly to classic gold hours. And without the constant roar of the crowd to drown out the noise in his head, the isolation he had been running from for nearly 3 decades closed in with terrifying speed. At home, things were even worse. His second divorce from Cassandra Delaney turned into a protracted, exhausting legal war over finances and custody of their young daughter, Jessie Bell. The courtroom proceedings were messy, contentious, and thoroughly stripped of the quiet dignity Denver had always fought to maintain. For a man who had built his life on the ideal of pristine family values and harmonious relationships, sitting in a cold courtroom while lawyers tore apart his character and his parenting ability was deeply humiliating. The double life, once maintained with effortless polish, was now collapsing in plain view of everyone who knew him. In Aspen, locals who had once protected his privacy watched him deteriorate. The warm neighbor who waved to everyone on the street was increasingly withdrawn, seen mostly as a solitary figure wandering the periphery of the town he had helped put on the map. He was depressed, he was struggling to stay sober, and he was profoundly alone. The grand illusion that had sustained him, the belief that if he just smiled wide enough, sang sweet enough, and flew high enough, the darkness inside him wouldn't touch him, was finally crumbling to dust. And then came October 12, 1997. Denver was in Monterey, California, testing out a recently purchased Adrian Davis Long-Easy, an experimental amateur-built aircraft with a unique, somewhat awkward cockpit layout. The plane had a known quirk. The fuel selector handle was positioned behind the pilot's left shoulder, requiring the flyer to physically turn around in their seat and reach awkwardly to switch fuel tanks. Several flight instructors and mechanics had already noted the design flaw. But Denver, confident as ever in his instincts and still flying without a valid medical license or legal certification, took off into the crisp autumn afternoon sky over Monterey Bay. He was practicing touch-and-go landings. The weather was clear. The ocean below was calm. But around 5:28 p.m., while cruising at roughly 500 feet above the water, the aircraft suddenly sputtered. Denver turned his body in the cramped cockpit to reach back and toggle the fuel valve. In doing so, according to the official National Transportation Safety Board investigation, he inadvertently pushed on the right rudder pedal. The experimental aircraft banked violently, stalled, and plunged straight down into the cold waters of Monterey Bay. The impact was catastrophic. The crash was so violent that John Denver, the man whose face had been recognized by hundreds of millions of people across the globe, had to be identified by authorities using his dental records and fingerprints. He was 53 years old. The news hit the world like a physical blow. Fans wept in the streets. Radio stations across the country played "Take Me Home," "Country Roads" on an endless loop. Tributes poured in from presidents, world leaders, and music royalty. The global mourning was overwhelming, painting the picture of a beloved artist taken from the world in a tragic freak accident. But as the immediate shock faded and investigators began sifting through the wreckage of both the plane and the life he left behind, a far darker and more complicated picture began to emerge. The reckless flights, the suspended licenses, the secret binges, the shattered marriages, the desperate, unyielding performance. All of it pointed back to a central, devastating truth that Denver had carried silently from his childhood all the way into the ocean. And when you finally look past the music, past the sunshine, and past the 28-year facade, the true reason for his double life becomes impossible to ignore. When aviation investigators and biographers began piecing together the final years of John Denver's life, one detail stood out with haunting clarity. A detail that tied together the flying, the drinking, the broken marriages, and the 28 years of carefully guarded secrets. His father, Henry Duchendorf Sr., was not just any military man. He was an Air Force aviation legend, a decorated pilot who held multiple world airspeed records in the B-58 Hustler supersonic bomber. To Henry Sr., flying was not a hobby. It was the supreme test of human courage, discipline, and masculine worth. And to that hardened, record-setting father, an acoustic guitar and a handful of gentle folk songs were something close to an embarrassment. For decades, the public believed John Denver took to the sky because he loved the mountains and the feeling of open air. But the people closest to him knew the deeper, more painful truth. Every single time Denver climbed into a cockpit, every time he pushed an aircraft to its absolute limits, and every time he refused to ground himself even after the authorities suspended his license, he was doing what he had been trying to do since he was 6 years old. He was trying to make his father proud. He was trying to prove that the gentle boy with the stutter and the acoustic guitar had the exact same grit, the exact same nerve, and the exact same courage as the cold military icon who never told him he was good enough. The double life was never a cynical marketing scheme. It was an emotional fortress built to protect a deeply wounded child. In 1969, when Henry John Duchendorf Jr. cast off his family name and stepped into the persona of John Denver, he created a character who was entirely unassailable. John Denver could not be rejected. John Denver radiated pure, unconditional love. John Denver was embraced by millions of mothers, fathers, and children across the planet. But as the years went on, that persona became a terrifying psychological trap. Every time the applause faded, every time the tour bus went quiet, and every time the hotel room door clicked shut, the real man was left alone with the agonizing realization that all that adoration wasn't for him. It was for the mask. That unbearable fracture is what destroyed his marriages. It is impossible to let someone truly love you when you are convinced that the person underneath the stage persona is fundamentally defective. It is what drove the secret binges behind closed doors, because alcohol was the only anesthesia that could temporarily quiet the relentless shame. And it is what made the experimental cockpit of that long-easy aircraft so dangerously alluring on that October afternoon in Monterey. In the air, suspended between earth and heaven, he didn't have to be the golden superstar, and he didn't have to face the broken man on the ground. This is the profound, heartbreaking irony of John Denver's legacy. He spent nearly 3 decades giving the world an idealized vision of peace, family, and home. When he sang about country roads leading you back to the place where you belong, he was offering his listeners a sanctuary that millions of people still carry in their hearts today. But the man behind the microphone lived in permanent emotional exile. He could build that home for us through 3-minute melodies and soaring acoustic choruses, but he could never find a way to live inside it himself. Today, when you put on those classic records, the warmth in his voice is still there. The golden sunshine still pours through the speakers. But now, when you listen closely, you can hear something else lying just beneath the surface of the harmonies. The quiet, beautiful, devastating plea of a little boy who just wanted to be loved for who he really was. For 28 years, John Denver convinced the world that he was the happiest man alive. A gentle soul who belonged to the mountains, the music, and the millions of fans who worshipped him. But the real reason he built that impossible facade wasn't about fame, wasn't about money, and wasn't even about the addiction or the broken marriages. The truth traces back to a single, shattering moment from his childhood. A moment so devastating that it rewired everything about who he believed he was allowed to be. And once you hear what really happened to Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. before he ever became John Denver, you will never listen to Take Me Home, Country Roads the same way again.